Hello, Jacqueline. How are you?
Good. How are you?
Doing well.
In full transparency, I first came across you after hearing your interview with Chris Wark, and it really touched me. And I immediately thought that my listeners, as well as myself, could really benefit from your wisdom and your guidance. So I reached out
I'm
over
glad to hear
Instagram.
that.
Glad that you answered, and I'm really honored to be chatting with you today.
Yeah, thank you I'm glad it's always good to hear that you never know who's listening. You appreciate it. You never quite know how things land with people. So we've gotten some good feedback from that interaction with Chris. And so really glad you reached out. Love the opportunity to hopefully encourage people. And
Yeah.
you're creating a good framework to do that.
Absolutely. And it's funny because I think most of my podcast episodes thus far have really focused on the physical aspect to health and healing.
Mm-hmm.
But there's so much more to that, right? Emotionally, mentally. And that's really an area that I'm most interested in.
Mm-hmm.
So as we head into the new year and folks are out there making their resolutions and their new habits, I figured it'd be a good time to dive into some of that.
Yeah, it's absolutely vital. Obviously, our head, hands, and hearts are integrated. We're a whole human and not these independent parts. Yeah, seeing all that as one system is really important.
Yeah, absolutely. Shad, I would like to start because you have quite an incredible mission with your ministry, and I know that was born from your own personal healing and growth journey. So, with that, could you maybe give us the SparkNotes version of essentially how you found yourself in the counseling space?
Yeah, I tell people I did not walk into counseling voluntarily. I was pushed into it, so to speak. I think life has a way, and I'll talk about often the performance-based identity. And so I would describe myself as having lived by a performance-based identity. And that's a research-based term that if you help me remember, I'll come back to. But the performance-based identity has a shelf life, and we're all going to hit it in some way, shape, or form because we're not made to transcend humanity. We're not made to get so powerful that we have all the control that we aspire to or fantasize about having, where we can will things to happen. And for my journey, I was very hardworking. I was very committed. I was very diligent. I was very disciplined. I'd get up early. I'd stay up late. I just the grind vibe, just doing what needed to get done, outworking, outpacing. And also, I jokingly say that we for my family, the younger you were when you did something, the sweeter it was supposed to be. So there was this sense of urgency that it had to happen sooner. And when I was the youngest this and the youngest of that, I'm the youngest of 8 kids. And all of us play a musical instrument. My dad launched a family band, the Berry Family Band, where we were the world's largest big band consisting of one family. And Jacqueline, just so your listeners will be impressed, was, according to my father, the world's youngest trumpet player in a big band consisting of one family. So it was like, it really started at an early age that I blew my first note when I was 3, that I got married at 20, got a house at 21, got first kids at 21, 22. And so like, it just was like this torrid pace. So I say all that to say it was untenable, or in the words of AA or ACA, the recovery community, it was unmanageable. So the proverbial kind of straw that broke the camel's back was that my wife, I was working on our family business, and I decided to leave that context. And that was a very relationally challenging experience. My wife also had simultaneously had our second miscarriage. We have 4 kids. We had 6 pregnancies. 2 of those ended in miscarriage. And this one was particularly bad. She had a uterine infection and really could have cost her life if things had progressed in a negative direction. Thankfully, she recovered and was okay, but we realized we wanted to expand our family. So we decided to go through an adoption process. And for those who, some of your listeners will be familiar with that journey, but it was a pretty long journey. It started out as an international adoption, then we shifted to domestic adoption. Wow. And I'm terrible with time frames. My wife always corrects those dates, but it was a couple of years, let's just put it that way, before a birth mom actually chose us. And the 2 years of waiting was really the anticipation. All the while, I would say that after the miscarriage and leaving the family business, we were really depleted and did not know it. So looking back, we were depressed. We were anxious. And there was a part of us that was like, once this adoption goes through, then everything will, like, this just has to be the thing, because this is what we're pursuing and have our hearts set on and felt like we've been called to. And as the story goes and our experience goes, we were finally selected by a birth mom who was doing a month. And a month after we had met her, she went into labor. We went to the hospital. We were there for the whole time. And sometimes I share this part, the kind of the intimate detail was like, I was really afraid that I would feel differently about my adopted son than I did about my biological children. And so I really prayed intently that it would be bone of my bone, flesh of my flesh. And it was. When we first met him and held him, it was like this beautiful experience that this was my son. 4 days later, we got to take him home from the hospital. And he got to meet him, introduced to our families and friends who had been along this journey with us for a pretty long time. And in the state of Tennessee, the birth mom has 10 days to revoke her right of surrender from the day you leave the hospital. And so on the 9th day, I was in my office and got a phone call from the adoption agency, and I had this sickening sense that they were going to tell me what I most feared, which was that the birth mom had changed her mind. And in fact, that's what they told me. And it was just we use language like a punch to the gut, slap to the face, a stab in the back, which we try to use human experiences to describe pain because that's the best we can do to describe internal. And that's what it was. I used the language, it was like calluses being torn from my hand and that raw flesh. And I call it a severe mercy. It was severe because it was super painful. It was merciful because it woke me up. I was in a state of denial that I didn't know. I didn't know. I wouldn't have said I'm in denial of what am I denying? I had been in denial of the fact that life had gotten to me, that I was not bigger than life. I was not more powerful than life. And I needed help. That was the big admission, was like, I can't fix this. And the other part that I thought was really transformative was my hope and prayer had been that I would not feel differently about my adopted son and than my biological kids. And what I realized was there's no way to love fully, like to really truly love sincerely and escape pain. Yeah. That my prayer had been answered, not in the way that I wanted it to be answered. So it felt like a death. And it was a death. It was a death of a dream. It was a death of a vision. It was a death of a hope. It was a death of a relationship, but nobody died. So that was a very confusing experience. But to realize that if I was going to allow myself to care, if I'm going to allow myself to live with a passion for anything, then that means I'm going to attach to people, places, and things that serve that mission, which also means, guess what? It's going to hurt a lot. And this is the kind of the unconventional motivational speech of the day of let's go suffer together. And it's like, it is more inspirational than motivational so that was my journey. So I started seeing a counselor, Tim Holler, who was my counselor for a couple of years, became a friend and then became a business partner at Cardia. And God used him to put Humpty Dumpty back together again and to really start to show me the elements of my humanity that I just had no concept of or context for, this whole realm of human emotions and my limbic brain. And so that really, I gave you a really long answer to that. That wasn't the Spark version, I'm sorry. But anyway, it touches on some of the things I think that we're going to be getting into.
Absolutely. No, that was beautiful, Shad. And as you were telling that story, there were so many themes that resonated with myself too, one of which was being content in the waiting season. And I feel like so many people today have this sense of, I will be happy when, right? When I hit that goal, when I make the X amount of money. And I think like the irony is that life is waiting, right? Like for the most part of our lives, we are in that waiting season. Mm-hmm. And it's learning how to be content in that waiting season and rely on God and the control aspect, right? I myself, it's funny, I feel like our conversation is going to be more of a therapy session for myself, but even too with me, the older I get, the more I'm starting to see habits in myself that are not the healthiest, one of which is that need for control. And I've noticed, Shad, that in areas of my life where I feel like I'm out of control, like my mom's health, for example, my mom was diagnosed with stage 4 breast cancer a few years ago. She's really the reason why I started WellnStrong. But that is an area that I've learned is completely out of my control, right? Her life is in God's hands. But interestingly, I've started to notice that when I feel less and less in control of her and her health, I tend to channel that control in other places of my life,
Mm-hmm.
right?
Mm-hmm.
And I put like extra control on having everything be perfect in another form, whether that be my business or my friendships or a salary. And with that, I'm really trying to figure out, how do you properly channel that? And I'm sure you've
Mm.
experienced this. It sounds like we have similar personalities, but what are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, you said a lot. Number one, I'm sorry to hear about your mom. How's she doing?
She's good, thank God. We've been doing a lot of different complementary therapies. That's obviously how I heard about Chris' work years ago.
Mm-hmm.
We've abided by a lot of his work and his teaching. But again, God is in control.
Yeah. No, so I think one of my major realizations and themes has become surrender, freedom and surrender. If that were a mantra of, because I'm in a constant tension, and I don't want to present myself as having escaped any of these things. Like, this is not, oh, this is where I used to be. This is where I am. So as a human, what I am destined for is struggle. And the waiting you described is surrendering in the struggle. That I am in an active, healthy struggle to live fully. It's rooted in this deep desire to live, to connect, to attach, to be secure. And so when I am trying to control, I'll use the expression often that the workload is not what kills us. We go around often citing how busy we are, how much there is to do, how much I have to get to. There's not enough hours in the day, which is really a victimhood way of seeing life. And it's not all that you have to do that's killing you. It's trying to control everything, control my image, control what people think of me, control what I look like, control how I compare, control outcomes. And so it's really the art of living. I think the wisdom of living is knowing what to surrender. And that's the beautiful part of the serenity prayer that we cite in our groups often, of grant me the serenity to accept what I cannot change, the courage to change what I can, and the wisdom to know the difference. And that goes on. That's the most popular part of that prayer. But what you're describing in contentment, surrender, acceptance is really probably the operative word of accepting. And accepting is not resignation either. It's really important to differentiate these terms. When I surrender, I'm surrendering what's outside of my control and ultimately my responsibility.
Mm-hmm.
And I'm trusting that there's something, someone, a higher power, more bigger than myself, that sees more than I see, that cares more than I realize, that can be with me in the fear, because it is scary. Like, it's never not scary. Doing this is scary. Like, doing anything that you care about is going to come with some level of fear. Yeah, the control mechanism that attempts to reach beyond my grasp, and then the really detrimental part of that cycle is that then I judge myself for not being superhuman.
Yep.
So I'm demanding the impossible. Then I'm judging myself based on an impossible standard. And so then I'm intolerant or have contempt for myself as a human in my limitation.
Yep.
And that's what keeps us sick. That's what keeps me doing, because then how do I cope with that? I have to pretend to be more than I am. I have to lie about what I have or don't have. I have to hide what I really am. And now we're into this whole arena then of, why are we so anxious? That's why, because it's not enough to be a human-sized human. Is not enough. I've got to be a super-sized human. Or the flip side of that coin, we also see people go subhuman. So I either have to become a supersized human, or I go subhuman, and I'm like, I'm just terrible at everything. I've never been good at anything. Jacqueline, you're great. Look at all this stuff you do. You've just got all these gifts and skills, and you have all these people that like you. And I just don't. So then we get into this really death spiral so there's two sides of how we respond to that. But yeah, control is a killer.
Yeah. Just tactically, Shad, what are some things that people can do, like behaviorally, even if that's just, again, like a mindset shift, maybe things in the morning, like just strategies that people can use to help alleviate that burden?
Yeah, I think if I can take us back a bit to go backwards before we go forward on that question, one of the things that we emphasize a lot in our coaching work and our counseling, it seems to me that we have it. What the phrase emotional intelligence gets thrown a lot in my circles, in business circles, and leadership communities. And emotional intelligence, really by definition and practice, is my ability to identify, name, and express what's happening inside of me limbically. Neuroscience tells us that your limbic brain is where your emotions live. It's fully developed when we're born. It doesn't have a voice and it doesn't know time. So your limbic brain doesn't care whether it was 5 years ago, 10 years ago, 15 years ago, 25 years ago that you experienced some pain or fear or traumatic event. It just knows that we don't want to feel that again. Yeah. So you've got these emotions, and the best way and literally we're made to think, we're made to feel before we're made to think cognitively. Your neocortex, the frontal lobe, the Einstein brain, that's developed much later earlier in women, later in men. But that's where voice comes from. That's where measuring consequence. So one of the greatest gifts that I think we can offer other human beings that helps them join the human race is to give them the gift of their emotions. That because we spend so much energy trying to avoid what we think is negative. I'm an Enneagram 7. I'm an enthusiast. I'm a believer. I'm activistic. So like I want to avoid pain and sadness as much as possible. I want pleasure, and I want to multiply it. If it's good once, it's good 1,000 times. The more, the better, which is not always true. So I think one of the first steps for anybody is to really find a way to identify and name what you're actually feeling and appreciate that as a gift. Those are gifts. If we accept them and respond and take responsibility for them, if I live in denial of them, then they become impairments. And so it's going back to that whole concept of control, that when I'm trying to control and live in denial, then I have to do something to cope with that denial to keep me in it, versus surrendering to the reality that life hurts. It's lonely. It's sad. I can feel shame and guilt and gladness all at the same time. And those be all appropriate things that mean I'm actually living, versus those being negative things about me that I have to avoid. So I wanted to say that before I talked about any practical steps, because I can use these practical things as other ways to try and mask what's really going on if I don't accept the invitation to show up as a human. So when I meditate, or when I'm getting ready to do ice baths with Chris, or when I'm doing uncomfortable things or workouts, man, I'm scared to do this. I don't want to do this alone. Will you do this with me? I won't get in an ice bath by myself. Like I will only do that right now if somebody's doing that with me. And it's incredible. And I know it's beneficial, but there's just nothing in me that wants to do that solo. Yeah. So being able to say, man, I'm scared. I really want to do this. My anger is more passion. My passion is bigger than my fear, and enjoy the relational component of that. Yeah. So I think that's if you find yourself in any way, shape, or form, if you struggle to express your your interior world in a way that is responsible, then that's where I would guide you toward really focusing some of your attention and time and care that you might receive. And then, of course, we can certainly dive into that more if you want to, or in some of those other practical steps. But those emotions will oxygenate and hydrate whatever other steps you're doing to stay connected to yourself, God, and others.
Yeah, no, that makes complete sense. And before we jump into the actual strategy, Shad, one thing that kept popping up as you were talking is my dad would always tell me, emotions are not rational, they just are. And it's okay to feel them. And I think too, we've all suppressed emotions at some point or another, whether that's like sadness or grief, but again, through actually addressing them, right, and really understanding why we're feeling what we're feeling, that's how we're able to overcome them. And even too, I've noticed that sometimes like emotions, they mask each other, in the sense of anger could actually be a camouflage for fear, right? Because it's easier to be angry than to admit someone hurt us. And I only came to that realization through actually being able to experience one of the feelings I had and really get to the root and say, where is this stemming from? And now whenever I'm around a situation that may perhaps in the past have been triggering, I'm not triggered anymore, right? I don't feel those
Hmm.
emotions that arise because I've identified the source. And the irony is that's what holistic medicine is too, right? It's addressing a disease at the root. So definitely a lot of
Yeah,
synergies here, but it's
absolutely.
just so important.
So this whole idea of control, and one of the resources, one of my mentors, a guy named Dr. Chip Dodd, who's in Nashville, he wrote a book called Voice of the Heart, and it's a resource I lean heavily into. And so in his model, each of these core 8 feelings have a gift when expressed and taken responsibility for, and they have an impairment when denied. Control, anxiety, and rage are all impairments of fear. So when I'm trying to control things, when I'm aware that I'm trying to control something or someone, then I'm aware that what am I actually, like, asking myself the question, what am I afraid of? And so then I can actually identify what am I responsible for and what risk is there right now that's at stake, right? That I'm leaning into. Because some fears are very rational. They're very legitimate. There are things I want my kids to be afraid of, that every stranger that wants to give you candy is not your friend. Being afraid, the gift of fear is faith and wisdom. And so you pointed out the anger, using that. Rage and anger are 2 very different things. Rage is me raging against my fear because I don't have tolerance for it, whereas anger is my passion for something that is more important to me than the pain I will experience when I pursue it. Everything you teach, everything you're describing, everything you stand for is calling people, inviting people to do things that are inconvenient, that are more important than the inconvenience. Like, I don't have time to meal prep. I don't have time to research. I don't have time to slow down. Or whatever the case may be. You're saying you are worth more than that, and your future self and the benefits that your future self will derive are worth the sacrifice today. So it's beautiful. It really animates my heart and life, I think, when we're able to connect in those terms.
Yeah, no, absolutely. And I think the irony too is that, again, so many of us are focused on the immediate gratification, right? Of eating that donut, eating that cookie. I don't want to go to the gym. I want to eat past 7 o'clock at night. And again, it's recognizing what are you doing for yourself now that's going to benefit your future self, right?
Yeah, and if I can, just add to that, we're seeking relief. So
Yeah.
when I'm in denial of the inevitability of pain, then we live in a world that because we are so well resourced and affluent nationally, we have at our disposal endless mechanisms to relieve our discomfort. So we literally can amuse ourselves to death. We can protect ourselves to death. We can insulate and we can relieve and alleviate and medicate all of these little discomforts. And they never are satisfying. They're never gratifying, but they are effective in the short term. And so really for people to think, am I trying to relieve this or am I taking responsibility for it? And that really is a step toward taking responsibility for my own well-being, for my own health, for my own relationships. Instead of life happening to me, it's happening for me. It's moving me towards something bigger than myself, moving me. Yeah. So yeah, it's a really important point of immediate gratification is really just saying it's just the infant inside of me that's saying, I want it now. I want relief now, because the waiting and the struggling and the suffering in between feels unbearable, but it's not.
No, absolutely. This leads us to what we were chatting about before in terms of actual strategies, right? That we can use to help us express our emotions in a healthy manner. I feel like too much of anything is not necessarily good. And I think it's really interesting that I've heard of situations where people, I guess, transition their addictions from drugs and alcohol to becoming extreme exercisers. And how do you reconcile that? And again, what are some healthy outlets to
Yeah.
relieve those pent up emotions without going overboard?
Yeah. I don't, it's a little counterintuitive because we tend to when we think about emotionally expressive people, we are typically caricaturizing people operating in an impaired state. So because it's so rare to see people talking in their about their emotions or expressing emotions in a healthy, responsible way. We have more examples of what would feel like more self-pity or more rage or more denial. Putting yourself in circles and spaces and places where that's done responsibly is a great way to practice being attentive, or becoming more attuned would be the appropriate word. I think so. That would be one element. I think the other really important piece is recognizing, where am I limited? What are my limitations? When I'm thinking in terms of becoming overwhelmed, when I think in terms of people burning out, what we're saying is, you haven't burned out, your ego has. The false self of who you thought you had to be and how you thought you had to perform has reached its limitation. It's predictable. It's a well-worn path. Millions and millions of people have tried it before me and failed. So it's why would I think it's going to be any different for me? And this is really maybe not as practical as you might be thinking at the moment, but like when I do my own story work, when we invite people, Dan Allender has a great book called To Be Told. And I think it's a great introduction to helping people appreciate why your story matters. Because a lot of my ego, which is the false self that I feel like it's the more presentable version of myself that I think is more acceptable. And so that ego has to die in order for me to actually live. But that ego served you for a period. Like, it protected you from something, it insulated you, and it served you until it doesn't. So you being able to identify and name and describe that ego state, like, who is that? What are they needing? What are they wanting? What are they afraid of? Because it's really self-protective. So I think finding pathways to reconnect with, because your ego is a response, a defense mechanism responding to things that you have experienced, that you may have minimized or determined didn't really matter, but they actually do. That would be another, maybe more of a therapeutic realm, I think, and really practically, because so much of what has aided me has been relationally centered, Jacqueline.
Mm-hmm.
Like, the two greatest antidotes to anxiety is intimacy, relationally. And I don't mean romantic. I'm just saying, like, connection, human, heart to heart,
Yep.
connectedness, and gratitude. And so because here's what happens. Here's what we do to ourselves. My ego can't have an intimate relationship or friendship with someone else's ego.
Mm-hmm.
It's fake and everybody knows it. It's a facade. It's not real. We're hiding pieces of ourselves. And by the way, I don't need to have that deep of a relationship with thousands of people. I need 3 or 4, and I am blessed to have many. And yeah, so that in terms of what can I do best for myself, and this ties back to where I started on the performance-based identity. There was a study done with Olympic athletes. Ben Holtberg did this research, and these were D1 or Olympic level athletes that had performed at a high level. And they did a study on how they fared after they retired from their sport. So some were thriving, some were struggling, some were depressed, some were married, families, successful. And he was like, what? And he was a D1. He ran Olympic trials, so at a high level. And so he was like, what's the difference? And there were a few, and I won't go into all of it, but there were a few key differentiators between those who were doing well and those who were not. Those who had a performance-based identity lived their life where their self-worth was contingent upon their performance. So I have self-worth if. The real hallmark differentiator between the two groups of purpose-based versus performance-based was the nature of their relationships. The athletes who were doing really well post-sport had relationships that were not connected to their sport. They had relationships that were not contingent on their performance at all, meaning the performance-based identities, all the relationships were agents and trainers and co-athletes and teams. They had all this community, but it was very dependent on, did they perform well enough to stay in that community? The purpose-based identity had the acceptance and the belonging, the mattering and belonging, which are the two greatest human needs, that they mattered and belonged to people where their performance was not a prerequisite to mattering and belonging. That's a game changer. If you and I know that we can go out and do courageous, scary things where we'll be vulnerable and our social self will be subject to judgment, but we know we have a place that we can return to where we matter and belong, regardless of whether we got our teeth kicked in or whether we actually excelled, that they won't love us more for excelling and they won't love us less for failing. That's the secret sauce. Anyway, I've got to do the journey in, so that I can also do the journey out. And the more I journey in, then the more I have to offer the people, the more I have with them, the more I can contribute to the people I want to journey out with. So.
Absolutely. And it just goes back to the point of, where do we put our identity in? And I think today, especially, people, again, put their identity in their career, their wealth, their accomplishments, how many books they've written. And I think that at the end of the day leads to emptiness. When we look at the Bible, Solomon, who was the wisest man in the world, acquired essentially all of this wealth. At the end of his life, what was his conclusion? Everything turns to dust. Life is empty. The only thing that matters is God. And again, he had it all. So again, even for me, I always remind myself, my worth is not based on my performance, because you're only as good as your last show, right? You're only as good as your last episode. If you put your identity in Christ, everything else just is a plus. It's just the icing on the cake. So I truly love that.
Yeah. And Chip, one of his favorite expressions is that on our best day, we are all giraffe on ice, which is actually the password to my Wi-Fi if you're ever at my house, just as a reminder. And you get the word picture, right? You picture this giraffe just clumsy, slipping, sliding all over. It's not made to be on ice. But to your point, if my identity is contingent upon how well I thought I did, which is extremely subjective, then I don't have the freedom to practice being human. To just, like, in yoga, we're practicing yoga. In medicine, they're practicing medicine. In law, they're practicing law. We build financial advisory practices. It's okay for you to practice. And the expression progress over perfection, that I am making progress and my identity is never at risk. So yeah, it's absolutely vital.
And one thing you touched on too, Shad, that I think is really important, that I wanted to emphasize with anyone listening, is the importance of your inner circle, right? And for me personally, I would probably say I have about 3 friends who I know if I called at 2 a.m. in the morning, they would pick up. These are friends that have known me before I even started WellnStrong. They know my faults. They know my flaws. They've seen me cry. And again, I just think it's really important to be very protective of that inner circle. And we've heard across the board from many successful people that you essentially become who you surround yourself with, right? So could you just touch on, again, like the importance of having an inner circle with people that you can just be real and honest with?
Yeah. So this gets into the practical part too, because we are progressing, right? We went through this, my internal world, what am I feeling, my limbic brain, my expression of that, and then who do I trust that with? Not everyone is worthy of being trusted with those pearls, that the most intimate, scary, shameful parts of our life, right? So really finding, and the truth is 99.9% of the world does not care what happens to you. It's my job to find the 0.01% that do. And when I can create when I can create an environment where vulnerability is normative. And what does that mean? So we haven't touched on this, but you've alluded to it, of this, what really is the emotion of shame or toxic shame. The thing that keeps me from sharing some of the most embarrassing, or what I think are the most shameful parts of me, would be toxic shame. Toxic shame says that I have to become more than human in order to matter and belong. Like I said earlier, it means I have to hide things from the people I care the most about, which is what exhausts us. So for me to be able to have, and I'm similar, and I have attempted. I'm not a big believer in the word balance. I just don't know that's attainable, but I do love the word rhythm, because balance implies that I have some control. Life kicks me off balance routinely. Yeah, it's the whole life on life's terms. It's my son's getting his wisdom teeth out today, 5 days before Christmas. 3 days ago, that was not supposed to be happening. It's okay. My plans have changed. His Christmas is going to look different. So like life is always doing things that's what's supposed to happen, instead of it being like, can you believe that? So for me to be able to have people where I create this rhythm of connection with, where I have a handful of friends. Now I use an app called Voxer a lot. It's a walkie-talkie app, and some people love it, some people hate it. But so I have some groups with friends where I can Vox kind of real time. This just happened. I feel anger and hurt and sad and lonely. I'm afraid. And also knowing what I need. I don't need anybody to solve that. It's unsolvable. I just need to know that I'm not alone in it. I just need people to hold it with me, that can contain it and not judge me for being afraid, or not judge me for being mad or resentful. Man, like, if you can find, and when you find them, they are absolute treasures, because they help me stay grounded and present, so that I can keep looking. So I don't try to make my world small. If I didn't have that, I would make my life much smaller. And because that's the other response to control. When I can't control the bigger world, what do? I have to keep making my world smaller until I get it small enough to where I feel safe. And we're not made to live that way. We wither and die in isolation. Nothing good happens in isolation. So yeah, you're spot on. That's why I love some of these tools like Voice of the Heart. There's a book called People Fuel. I keep handy. People Fuel, John Townsend, Chip Dodd, Voice of the Heart. I can send links to these, but those are two great resources to help me put language to what am I feeling emotionally and what am I needing relationally. Because all of our deepest needs are met in relationship. Townsend calls them relational nutrients. It's oxygen and water. If I'm cut off from those things, even you'll be interested in this, and you may already know this, research for people that have been to outer space, for people that have been in research projects in isolation in Antarctica, that's tough to say, people that have been in nursing homes for extended period of time in isolation, their brains literally shrink.
Wow.
It literally shuts down the gray matter, and your brain literally gets smaller when you're in extended period of isolation. For infants and for seniors, they call it failure to thrive. So it's a big deal. It really is life. It really is life and death.
Yeah, no, that's so interesting. I'd love to get the links to those books. I actually am currently working on my Christmas list, and most of that consists of books, so I'll be adding those to that list. Yeah, and also too,
Well,
Chad,
I'll send some to you, but I'll send those to you too. But I'll get you the links too.
Wonderful. And also too, I think it's important to recognize that in an age of social media where we seemingly have all this connection, right? People have thousands and thousands of friends, thousands of followers. You can still have that and be lonely, right? And I think we live in an age where, sure, the breadth of our relationships like might be expansive, but the depth is lacking a lot.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
And yeah, could you just touch on social media?
I know.
It's good. It's a double-edged sword. That's how I describe
Mm-hmm.
it.
Mm-hmm. It's a tool, but it's not a substitute. So I really great point. I love this conversation. So the difference between a dream and a fantasy is a picture of the future where life works without risk or pain. It's a fantasy because it's not attainable. A dream, Martin Luther King had a dream, not a fantasy. He knew that it was going to cost him a lot, and it did. Anybody that's ever done anything of substance and of note, big or small, there's been a cost to it and risk associated with it. And I'm using some extreme examples, but sometimes it's much smaller and less obvious than that. So the fantasy of that my connections relationally can be substituted for a digital meta type virtual universe is extremely misleading and misguided and dangerous, because we have the appearance of relational connectivity without the substance of it. So it's really what we would call satiation. It satiates, it scratches the surface of, oh, I had a good, meaningful human interaction. But to your point, I can still be very lonely because I was not as known. Part of me was known, but I also need to be known more fully. I don't know that we can ever be full. I don't even fully know myself, but we can be more fully known, right? When I'm in a relationship with someone and I have not had to edit what's true about me and they accept me, now I'm getting nourished. If I'm in a relationship with somebody and I have had to significantly edit and hide big parts of myself, I am not getting nourished because I know that there's parts of me that are still yet deeply hidden. I know that I'm as accepted as to the degree that I've been able to bring myself to them. So I can be in a room full of people around tons of individuals that claim to love me and still be very isolated and very alone because I'm not actually known in that social context. So it's really good point.
Yeah, that could be a whole episode in itself, Shad. But and also too, I mean, social media just feeds ego, right? That's the whole point of it. It's what am I doing? What did I have to drink this morning? Quite honestly, I deactivated my personal social media accounts a few years ago, and I rarely go on them. But I'm pretty active on WellnStrong because I like to create more than
Mm-hmm.
consume. So to your point about it being a tool, it can be a tool for good, right? But again, it's within your control and within your power of how often you use it, how you choose to use it, what you choose to consume.
Really good point. And I love the purpose. There is purpose for what you're describing of how you're using it with purpose and intention. Going back to my emotional state, am I aware when I am becoming more anxious? Am I aware when am I using it as a mechanism or a means to numb myself? And am I aware and attuned to what's actually happening inside of me and what it's tempting me to think or believe or act or behave? Or am I using it with purpose and intention? There's obviously, I love seeing my friends and people I know and other resources on there and celebrating those things, the hobbies that I enjoy to engage in. And I'm also aware of like when I start feeling awful about myself and judging myself with contempt of going, take a step back, put it down, figure out what's going on. And I'd add that to this whole, you've asked me, and I don't know if I've actually answered your question fully, but the like practical habits of the 3 S's, which we typically are awful at, is the solitude, silence, and stillness. Mm-hmm. That is just a lost art that historically I think has been more embedded in our culture. And so we try to remedy our exhaustion often by speeding up the treadmill versus getting off of it. So I'm so tired. I need this thing to go faster. I don't think that's the way. So do you have a practice of being with yourself? Like just being by yourself. And that doesn't mean you're on your phone. That doesn't mean you're on your devices. That doesn't mean you're reading anything. It's, can I just be with myself? Solitude is an intentional aloneness. I'm going to go, because you do have a relationship with yourself. And I think that's probably one of the core messages here is getting in touch and attuned with your own emotional state is really about my relationship with me, stewarding all that I am and have and am trusted to me. Yeah, I think those practices of just being still, being silent. I try to go to an abbey about 2 times a year where it's 3 days of silence. And as you can tell, I'm a talker. Wow. And everybody was like, you are not going to be able to do that. And I go there and I will sleep for 11 hours a night, like where I've got no technology, nobody to talk to, nobody to interact with. And it is the best. It's like my body craves it. Like I start craving it now. Like I feel myself needing it. And so just having a practice of that as part of your rhythm, I think is really vital.
There's a retreat. I'm trying to look it up right now. I think, Vipassana. Have you heard of that? It's essentially like a 10-day retreat where people just go and they just, again, they sit in silence, they meditate. You're not allowed to have your phone or anything, any other distractions. I don't know if I could do 10 days. I don't even know if I could do 2 days, but that's definitely
you could. Yeah, you could. It's stillness is actually harder for me than silence. Being still, it took some getting used to because I do like to be active and move, but your body needs it. So it's like when you're giving yourself something that your body needs, it's like it says thank you. So if you could do it. And for everybody listening, don't feel like you have to go do a multi-day. Try it for an hour. Try it for 4 hours. Try it for a day. Practice some level of Sabbath, some level of cessation from work. Pay attention to how compulsively I reach toward things, just like without thinking about it. What's that about? I wonder what would come up in me if I didn't reach for that now. And it might be painful, but it might be worth it too. It might be worth exploring writing about, meditating on. So there's value in it.
Yeah. Here's a question for you, Shad. So I've noticed, again, just from observing my own behavior and my thoughts over the past year or so, that silence is challenging for me, particularly because I'm afraid of what comes up in my mind when I am silent,
Mm-hmm.
right? And I think most people, like, that is often the root cause. So I find myself always listening to podcasts, or I guess with the intent of wanting to learn, or always wanting to be, you know, intent. How do I say it? Yeah,
Yeah,
it's
intentional,
just
right?
intentional. Yeah, and it's just like when I find myself sitting in silence, I find myself ruminating on things, right? Things in the past that I can't change,
Mm-hmm.
things that I wish that would have gone differently. And I think that's the perfectionist nature in me.
Mm-hmm.
So, just tactically for people out there who really want to make an effort to meditate and be in that silence, what do we do when those thoughts come up? And I know it's not a matter of suppressing them. I've heard people say, acknowledge it. Imagine like a
Mm-hmm.
river in your mind where the thought comes up and then you just let it continue to flow down the stream. But
Mm-hmm.
for me, the thought keeps coming on the stream in like a
Mm-hmm.
circular path. And I just like, how do you deal with that?
Yeah, I think it's a really good question. And I've definitely had experiences where I've had these very troubling, disturbing thoughts that really deactivated me, that or activated me, or dysregulated me, that I just couldn't shake. That was a different experience that just took time and being able to be with people who could tolerate me being somewhere I didn't want to be. Like
Yeah.
I don't want to feel or think about. And I would say that those experiences were not based on something that actually happened. It was more of a fear of what could happen, or me imagining the absolute worst, catastrophizing. So that's one thing. And I think bringing that to other people, to the light, where you can have some objective feedback, becomes really important. That using negative energy, like, trying to hold the dam back, is absolutely exhausting. Letting that river flow, to your, metaphor of, okay, I'm not powerful enough to stop this on my own, and believing that it's not going to be there forever. The other side of that, I think, in the more dated, just parts of my story that I want to avoid, where if I'm still and I start to feel the things I'm afraid of, and I start to feel people that, for me right now, when I'm still there, I have a lot of relationships that I feel extremely sad about how they've landed, or where they are, or how they ended. And those often come up, of like imagining conversations. And so being able to write about my grief over what they are, my anger for what I wanted them to be or what I had hoped for, grieving my powerlessness over trying to make it right or different. That is actually incredibly healing. It's part of the process of surrendering, learning to accept, even being okay with what's not okay. Some of that brokenness and loss, there's nothing you could say to me. There's nothing anybody could say to me to make it okay that we lost Henry, our adopted son. There's nothing that makes that okay. And we're going to be okay. It's not going to kill me. And so that I am resilient enough to bear it well, but not by myself. I am incredibly strong. I believe I'm a strong human, but not alone. I'm exceedingly weak. And
Yeah.
so being able to sit with that, bring that to trustworthy people, I guess the clinical term would be a meta process, like putting language to what I'm feeling. But yeah, the invitation you're putting out there, and what I'm really trying to encourage people toward, is let your story matter. Let your experience matter. There's no such thing as nature versus nurture. Nurture is really your experience of living that informs how you live out your nature. There's hardwired parts about your traits that are then informed by your experiences, your wins, your failures, your hurts, and your losses. And they all fit. They all matter. They all have a place. They're all sacred. Yeah, letting them come, not fighting or warring against them, and then finding your people that you can share them with.
Yeah. No, I absolutely love that. And another practice that personally has helped me so much is whenever I do have those thoughts, again, I meditate on what God says, right? God says, I promise to work all things together for your good and my glory, and to just really cast your anxieties on Him. So, again, whenever I find myself in the midst of those thoughts that are attacking me, I shift my perspective
Yeah.
Which
Well, it's truth. It's letting truth inform your reality, right? And
exactly.
the fear, especially in the faith community, it's for me, it was like fear was antithetical to faith. Like you shouldn't be afraid of anything because your faith is stronger than your fear. No, my faith is a byproduct of my fear. Like the fact that I'm afraid is what invites me into faith. And every time, and biblically, that you see Jesus show up or God speak to his people, when he confronts their fear, it's with his presence, not with shame. He's not, how dare you be afraid? He's saying, of course you're afraid. This is scary, but you're not alone.
Yeah.
Like I'm with you. So it's a relational. My youngest, at least all of my kids did this at some point, but they'd come when they were old enough to get out of their own bed and knock on my door. They'd knock on my door and say, "Hey, can I come into your room?" And you're like, "Why?" I said, "It's dark in my room." And he said, "And it's scary." So it's dark in my room too. Mom and Dad don't sleep with a nightlight. They're not afraid of the dark. We're afraid of being alone in the dark.
Right.
Who will be with me when darkness comes? Because it will, but it won't. It doesn't have to defeat you or destroy you.
I love that. I love that. Shad, you've touched on so many great topics. I'd love to have you back on because there's just so much to unpack. But I am curious, what are some life transforming habits that you
Yeah.
yourself have implemented or that even you've seen some of the people you work with use that have been really
Mm-hmm.
effective?
Yeah. Habits. I think the finding my routine. So very specifically, my favorite time of the day is the early morning. So I love to get up early and have still, quiet solitude with my perfect cup of coffee, and where I can journal, listen to readings and music that invites me into a bigger story than the one that I feel like I'm living right now. It puts everything in perspective for me. I love pairing that with Wim Hof breathing. That's just an easy app I use to just do a few rounds of breathing exercises. Like if you monitor your heart rate, or if you pay attention to like your HRV, seeing the impact that has on over time, my just watching my resting heart rate calm down, which is a decent metric, a good metric to know of yourself. Like, so that morning routine has been absolutely vital. Just like and before I would say historically that had been like this thing I should do that I didn't want to do. And now it's become this thing like I crave and I look forward to, because there is a relational connection with God in it and with myself. So it's really honoring that and prioritizing that. I'm still pretty bad on my sleep front. I still don't get enough sleep, and I'm working on that. I'm still somewhere between 6 or 7. I really want to have over 7 hours at least. But when I do sleep, it is incredibly powerful. One thing I always encourage people to do too is and this may not be true of everyone, but I tell everybody my estimator is broken. When it comes to money and time, I am like almost always wrong. Yeah. So I'm always like, it'll take 15 minutes. It'll take a day. It'll take this. It doesn't matter. I'm always wrong by like anywhere from 20 to 75%. Putting things on a calendar, and not just appointments, but what needs to get done. What is my priority? And so I have what I call my big three. Michael Hyatt has a system that I like that has informed this, but it's like the big three of the day and the week. And so if those things don't get time on my calendar, they will not happen. Not with the degree of intentionality that I want to give them. When I put those things on my calendar, then I have what it does is it protects my yes.
Yeah.
It takes 1,000 no's to protect one yes. If I don't have those things on my calendar daily, weekly, or monthly, then I will say yes to other things that will fill that space, that will prevent me from pursuing my priorities.
Yeah.
And that's problematic. That becomes dishonoring and harmful to myself. So it's really hard for me to say no, especially to fun things with people I love. And so and again, this is an ongoing practice for me, but I've got to put them on my calendar so that I can say, no, I've made a commitment and a promise to myself to do this thing during this time. And so it helps me a lot, just getting real practical. But your calendar, using it properly can be your greatest ally and defense, I think, in terms of pursuing what matters most. Now, if you haven't defined what matters most to you, then
Probably step number one.
that's another big conversation.
Yeah, it's so funny you mentioned that. I was literally just having this conversation with my mom yesterday because she just has so much like she has so much on her to-do list, Shad, but she doesn't necessarily have a lot of obligations. Like she has a lot of free time, but the day just tends to escape her. And that's why
Hmm.
I'm like, Mom, just block off time, 12 to 2, make phone calls, 2 to
Right.
4, do your EFT technique. So you need to have control over your schedule. And one other thing too that I personally have found super helpful is that whenever I do have that morning routine and I execute it, no matter however I'm feeling, getting into that cold shower. If I lived closer to you, Shad, I'd be getting into that cold water
Yeah.
therapy with
We
you
had the
because
ice
I'm a
bath. Yep.
huge ice bath enthusiast. But I think when you prove to yourself that you can do hard things,
Right.
it expands into other areas of your life. So if you
Oh,
do that cold
absolutely.
plunge in the morning, you can conquer the day. You can do that podcast episode. You can have a great presentation at your work meeting.
Hmm.
So
Hmm.
they truly carry over. This has been such an incredible conversation. Again, we've covered so much, but I do want to be conscious of your time. Where can listeners find you?
Yeah, the two best places I think would be cardiacollective.com is the practice management company for licensed professional counselors and coaches. So that's our collective of counselors and coaches. So some are licensed counselors, some are do coaches, some do both. That'd be where you could connect to do some of your own work or be resourced in that. Edmondson.group is the business advisory group and consulting and leadership development program that I co-lead with my partner, Ken Edmondson, and mentor and friend. So he and I work together to write and develop resources and curriculum to help mid-market business owners and leaders to be not only equipped to do their jobs well, but also stay emotionally, relationally healthy and present while they do it.
Awesome.
So those are the two, and I'm on Instagram as well. But you can find me out there pretty easily.
Wonderful. I will include the links to all of that in the show notes. But my last question for you, and this is often my favorite question
Uh
to
oh.
ask, it is my favorite question to ask, and that is, what does being well and strong mean to you?
Yeah, man, that's a great question. I love the combination of well and strong. In business, we talk about doing well and good. For a business to sustain itself, it has to deliver on its mission and do things that make it financially viable and sustainable. But so I think the word I would choose would be integrated. For me to be well and strong means that I'm integrated as a human being, head, hands, and heart. That there's alignment for and acceptance of to bear life on life's terms. So I would probably just put it in that integration category that I embrace that I'm an emotional being, I'm a physical being, I'm a spiritual being, I'm a relational being, and all of those things fit. One is not more. They all are very significant and matter. So if I can practice integrating those things, then I can be well and strong.
I love that. That was beautiful. Can I include that as a quote on my website? Shad, I'll quote you.
Absolutely.
Awesome. Thank you so much for your time. Truly such a pleasure speaking with you. I really enjoyed this conversation and
Yeah.
very excited to share with listeners.
Thank you for your courageous effort and your passion for putting this together and building this framework and putting yourself out there. It's a noble effort. So I hope that many are encouraged by it. So keep it up.
Awesome. Thanks so much, Shad.
All right. Take care.